What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about something that doesn't get discussed enough in mainstream conversations. America's history of involvement in coups and regime change, how that history connects directly to the war involving Iran today, as well as why so many American citizens feel disconnected from the foreign policy decisions being made in our name. This isn't about hating America. This is about understanding our history so we can better understand our present. When people ask why certain countries distrust or even hate the United States, we often are told it is because of our freedoms or our way of life. But if we're being honest, the answer is much more complicated than that. A big part of the resentment toward America is different parts of the world comes from action, or I'm sorry, different parts of the world comes from actions our government has taken over the last 70 years, especially during the Cold War and 9/11. Now let's start with the Iran in 1953. Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He decided to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had been heavily controlled by the British interests. That move threatened our Western economic power in the region, so the United States, working with the United Kingdom, supported what became known as the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, removing Mossadegh from power and strengthening the rule of the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah ruled for decades, and while he has seen as a strategic ally of the West, many Iranians viewed him as a regime as a corrupt and repressive one. Now that resentment built over time and eventually exploded in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which replaced the monarchy with the Islamic Republic we now know today. So when we look at the current war, the tensions involving Iran's missile exchanges, oil market fears, and regional instability, we can't ignore the fact that this history still shapes how Iran sees the United States. And Iran hasn't the only case, wasn't the only case. In 1954 in Guatemala, the United States backed the overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz after he introduced land reforms that affected American corporate interests. That intervention led to decades of instability in the Civil War in 1973. In Chile, President Salvador Allende was overthrown in a military coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power. Now, the classified documents show that the U.S. government worked to destabilize Allende's administration during the Cold War. Now, these actions were justified at the time as necessary to stop the spread of communism, but from the perspective of the world living in these countries, it looked like foreign interference in their democracy. Then we move forward in 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. The United States removed Saddam Hussein from power under the claim of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction. Now, those weapons were never found. The war destabilized the region and cost thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, and trillions of dollars. Even though Iraq wasn't a covert coup in the traditional sense, it was still regime change and it had consequences that are still being felt today. Hence, ISIS emerged through the vacuum of Iraq's dictator being overthrown. So when I look at the current conflict involving Iran, I see a pattern of long-standing mistrust from Iran's perspective. The United States helped remove their elected leader in 1953 and supported a monarch they eventually overthrew. The history doesn't justify the aggression or the violence today, but it does explain why trust between the two nations has been almost impossible to rebuild. And then here's where it hits home for us in America. Over the last 2 decades, especially after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the American people have become increasingly skeptical of foreign interventions. Many of us are tired of endless wars. We question the cost of the purpose and whether these conflicts truly make us safer. Yet at the same time, defense budgets remain massive, our overseas military bases remain active, and our military engagements continue. Presidents change and parties change, but our foreign policy often stays on the same trajectory. That creates a real tension. We call ourselves a republic, built on the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Now, we believed in freedom, rights, and representation, but when large portions of the population express opposition to war and the policies continue anyway, people start to feel disconnected from the system. And now, to be fair, we are not a direct democracy. We elect representatives to make complex decisions, especially in matters of national security, and they often have access to the intelligence, and that the public doesn't. Just simply don't. But the perception gap is real, and the perception shapes the trust we have. There's also a deeper contradiction that we have to wrestle with in America. It was founded on the idea of our self-determination on resisting outside control. Yet throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, we've sometimes interfered in the sovereignty of other nations when it's aligned with our strategic interests. At the same time, it's also true that American power has deterred wars. It's protected trade routes and supported allies around the world. The story isn't black and white, it's complicated. But if we want to understand why some of the countries distrust us, we have to acknowledge that our actions, not just our ideas, shape how we are seen. So when you hear people say, why do they hate us? I think it's more honest question is, what role has our government's foreign policy played in creating that hostility? Not because America is uniquely evil. Every major power in history has acted in its own interests. But we hold ourselves to a higher standard because we claim to stand for democracy and freedom. But at the end of the day, I believe a strong republic isn't one that pretends it has never made any mistakes. A strong republic is one that can openly examine its history and learn from it, and adjust its course when necessary. The current war, tensions involving Iran, didn't begin yesterday. They are rooted in decades of decision making and mistrust and unresolved conflicts. If we want a different future, we have to be honest about the past. If you made it this far, I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. These are the complicated issues, and they deserve more than headlines and talking points. If you found this discussion valuable, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I want to thank you once again for watching the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.